what we're seeing is a very specific, dramatic increase in murder and gun violence. There was about a 30% increase nationally in murder from 2019 to 2020. Year on year, it was by far the largest increase ever recorded. We have data going back to the 1960s in terms of national murder trends. The largest previous increase was 12.5% year on year. So a 30% increase was really dramatic.
Gun violence has been consistent as an American as an apple pie.
Unfortunately, the rise in violence has occurred just about everywhere in the United States without much difference regionally.
But the rise in gun violence impacts the population unequally.
The risk of homicide is much, much, much higher if you're Black than if you are any other race or ethnicity.
In the United States, Black people are over 12 times more likely to be a victim of gun homicide than white people.
Everything is pretty much set up and designed for some African-American youth to fail.
It feels like it's an attack on Black men. You know what I mean? It feels like, to be honest, like the world hates me. When I was 15, I knew I was going to die at 18 and I accepted it.
Trauma is ubiquitous in this area. The victims of violence are traumatized. The perpetrators are traumatized. The law enforcement and other officials who are working with these populations are traumatized. So having a trauma-informed approach to these issues is really important.
Here's why murder rates are rising in the US and what we can do about it. If you were to look at the overall crime data since the start of the pandemic, it doesn't look like there's much of a problem.
When we talk about crime going up or down, for the most part, in most places, crime is falling because people aren't out and about. You can't shoplift if stores have been closed in 2020 and 2021.
But when you separate out the data on murder, it becomes clearer that something has changed in the past few years.
A lot of these sort of crimes of randomness, crimes of mobility, which makes up that big capital C crime number, those are down thanks to the pandemic.
There are 4 major categories when talking about violent crime: homicide, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. Violent crime as a category rose about 5% between 2019 and 2020. Homicide, which is more colloquially referred to as murder, rose nearly 30%.
It's gun violence and murder which make up this tiny slice of overall major crime that is really what we're seeing, this sort of sustained increase.
Nearly 80% of murders in 2020 were committed with a firearm.
The rest of crime, which is generally more dependent on mobility, dependent on more random criminal acts, those haven't really increased.
It's very hard to know with certainty what drives crime trends. But I think there's broad agreement that there are at least 3 factors that are playing an important role. The first, of course, is the pandemic itself, which placed the individuals who are at the highest risk of violence under enormous pressure, and they were already under pressure to begin with. And at the same time, it put the institutions that are responsible for engaging those individuals, law enforcement, courts, and community-based workers, all under tremendous strain as well.
Investments in civic infrastructure reduce violent crime. For example, providing structured opportunities for kids and for adolescents, whether that's after-school programs or at summer jobs programs, it's lengthening the school day. All of these interventions reduce the risk of violent crime because we're giving teenagers and adolescents some place to go that's structured and safe. And during the pandemic, of course, that all fell apart.
The second factor is the social unrest that followed the brutal murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. There was a significant surge in violent crime immediately after the murder of George Floyd.
As people lose trust in the criminal justice system after sort of these widespread, instances of police shootings, they're less likely to participate in it plausibly, which leads to these very difficult to interrupt cycles of violence.
Highly publicized incidents of police violence really drive a significant wedge between police and the communities that they're supposed to serve. When they are disconnected, crime surges.
The George Floyd shooting to Black people was the last straw. You see this Black man suffering, with a knee in his neck, begging, "I cannot breathe, sir." You will be angry because at the end of the day, George Floyd looked like one of my uncles. When that happened, we just felt like, so y'all really just gonna kill us.
There was a time when people were scared to commit a crime in front of the police. Right now, a lot of people just can care less.
The cops are scared. When brothers that's committing these crimes are noticing that the cops are scared, why do you think the crime rates are so high? We already angry. You're not going to protect us. But what are we going to do?
Tio Hardiman is the executive director of the nonprofit organization Violence Interrupters, which helps facilitate gang mediation and works with high-risk young men and gang members.
Violence Interrupters is what you might say is a public health approach to reducing shootings and homicides here in Chicago and across the nation. We look at violence as an epidemic. It's learned behavior, and we have to train people and educate them on how to unlearn violent behavior.
I got shot in my head because of choices that I made in my past. Around that time, I had just stopped gang banging, just stopped selling drugs, carrying guns. I had just stopped. I remember at that time, I was trying to stop drinking. And I remember that night I slipped up. I went to the party, I got drunk. I remember telling myself right before I got shot, I have tomorrow. Ma'am, they shot the cop 28 times. They hit me and my friend in our heads. I was bleeding out my head like a faucet, but I survived. I've been doing different things to heal from that, giving back and trying to talk to people who's going through what I'm going through has helped a lot.
The third factor playing a significant role is guns, specifically firearms. And what we know is that there was a massive surge in legal purchases of guns during the pandemic.
There were an estimated 21 million guns sold in the U.S. in 2020, breaking the previous record in 2016 of just over 16 million sold. In 2021, that number dropped slightly to a little less than 19 million guns sold.
What we also know is that a larger share of those legally purchased guns were diverted into the hands of criminals more quickly than normal. Criminologists call this the time to crime, and the time to crime for most weapons, meaning the time a legally purchased gun eventually finds its way to a crime scene, is often 2, 3, 4 years. Unfortunately, the number of guns that found their way to a crime scene, newly purchased guns within 6 months, surged massively during the pandemic.
We know for a fact that poverty, we know for a fact that discrimination has played a very significant role in an adverse way when it comes down to poor communities, especially Black and brown communities, but in particular, the African-American community.
When we think about what drives a particular individual to commit a particular crime at a particular time, we tend to think about motive and opportunity and probability of getting caught. So motive oftentimes comes down to an economic motive, engaging in an illegal activity to get some kind of asset versus legal activity.
When you are born into poverty, or when you are faced with poverty, and it's like you see you cannot get the resources that you need, you give up and you start doing other things. We need help. We need resources. We need mental health services. We need jobs. We need help.
Many headlines have focused on the rise in gun violence in major cities, but only focusing on cities doesn't tell us the whole story.
New York City is the biggest city in the country. Chicago has the most N number of murders every year. So that's sort of, I think, why people fixate that. Also, the increase was not just a urban city problem. It wasn't a blue problem. It wasn't a red problem. Murder increased in big cities. It increased in small cities. It increased in the suburbs. It increased in rural counties.
The way the U.S. gathers crime data can make it difficult to determine exactly where crime is rising. Local police departments voluntarily report crime statistics to the FBI. The FBI then releases that data, but it's delayed.
If you want 2021, 2022 crime data, you have to go do it by hand, literally. And, there's a lot of cities and a lot of villages and a lot of towns and a lot of counties in the United States. So we're not getting a comprehensive collection of data, even if we go straight to the source.
Our collection of data from about 100 big cities with available data showed murder up about 6% last year relative to 2020, which we know big cities tend to overstate national trends.
The cities that saw the biggest increase in crime between 2020 and 2021 are spread out across the map. Most have populations under 1 million people and a mix of political affiliations for city leadership.
Often this gun violence is concentrating in poor communities of color in cities all across the country. However, it's actually much more concentrated than that. What we find is that crime doesn't just concentrate among a certain group of people or in a certain neighborhood. It actually concentrates in micro locations known as hotspots. And 4 to 5% of a city's geography of these hotspots can make up 60 to 70% of all violent crime.
In Chicago, a lot of the violence congregates around specific neighborhoods.
You just have to know where you're at. You have to know who's around you. People prey on the weak here. When you are so impoverished that you have nothing, you start looking for the easiest way to get something. And it's sad that people got to live like that. You know, it's sad, but this is the reality of our city.
A fraction of a percent of the city's population can account for the significant majority of gun violence incidents. And so one of the important things for policymakers to know is you don't have to be everywhere and work with everyone to make a difference.
What we do, as far as a public health approach, we gather all the data. We take a look at the times when most of the shootings and homicides occurred. We call it a timeline. We map the area. We look at the hotspot areas where most of the incidents take place.
TL's really been helping me understand the power that I have to speak. I work with a nonprofit called Fierce Women of Faith. The point of Violence Interrupters and Fierce Women of Faith is to get people out here that understand us so we can bring them to us, so we can show them there's resources, there's help, there's people that love you. Because Chicagoans feel like there's no hope.
We call it constructive shadowing, where we shadow the individuals and help them along the way. So it's like a hand-holding approach in the beginning, and then once a person becomes a productive member of society and begins to think on a higher level, then we turn them over to the overall society, and they should be okay.
Preliminary big city data from the first half of 2022 suggests that the murder rate may be declining year to date.
So that's a big debate in the conversation about violent crime, whether you should focus on root causes or whether you should focus on proximate causes. And the vast majority of the evidence says that if you want to address violent crime, the best way to do it is to do it directly, by identifying where it concentrates and among whom it concentrates, and then engaging those places and people.
There's some fairly simple things that we can do to deter violent crime. We know, for instance, that just putting up surveillance cameras deters violent crime. Having bright lighting makes a difference to violent crime if an area is lit up at night. Even if somebody is living on the margin and they want something or they need something and they want to get it then and they have a gun, they see an opportunity, if the probability of detection is increased, they won't take that action.
President Biden has urged cities to spend COVID relief money on police and crime prevention measures.
The answer is not to defund the police. The answer is to fund the police.
The calls to defund the police didn't actually result in that many places defunding the police.
In fact, in most departments, if you look at the budget data, police budgets have increased because cities are trying to address rising violent crime. We are seeing police departments make allocation decisions with the officers that they do have that are not always the optimal choices in order to address rising violent crimes. You know, the NYPD has announced they're investing in a strategy of making these misdemeanor quality of life arrests. And that's just, frankly, a misallocation of resources.
A spokesperson for the NYPD told CNBC, over the last 8 years, the NYPD has been forging fundamental changes in policing, including building strong relationships through neighborhood policing and by focusing resources on the drivers of violence through precision policing. The NYPD responds to and addresses crime complaints from the very communities it serves, and we focus on areas where the highest concentration of crime exists.
I think, unfortunately, the general public is generally being presented with a series of binary choices. Either you care about cops or you care about communities. Either you're for crime reduction or you're for social justice. And I think these are all false choices.
I always try to resist anybody making the argument that public safety is a Republican issue or it's a Democratic issue. We should all be on the side of doing the things that reduce violent crime victimization. And those things include traditional Democratic policy proposals like investing in health and education and economic opportunity. And they include traditional Republican policy proposals like supporting police departments and increasing police resources that are directed towards preventing and deterring violent crimes.
Public safety is a team sport, and so we need the members of the team to work together.